What if there's a better way than grade levels to frame how students progress through the K-12 curriculum? What if rather than basing academic progression on the age of a student, we instead focused on what they know and can do? Mike Burde is an assistant superintendent at Kenowa Hills Public Schools, where they have, as a district, embraced a concept they call personal mastery in learning. According to their website, personal mastery means that, rather than advancing based on time in a certain grade level, students advance only after they've mastered the content of their course. This stands in contrast to a more traditional time-based model of advancement, which many of us are probably familiar with, and where all students learn at the same pace in grade bands. The idea is, by mastering basic topics before moving on to more complex ones, students are less likely to fall behind their peers as lessons increase in difficulty. It's a way to ensure that all students can succeed, not just some or most. Empowered by this mission of learning for all, Kenowa Hills has become one of the earliest adopters of competency-based education in Michigan and hopes to leverage this innovative approach to learning to eliminate gaps that can so easily accumulate in the traditional model. To accomplish this, they've begun implementing Marzano's concept of high-reliability schools, which was developed by Dr. Robert Marzano and is the synthesis of 40 years of educational research, culminating in a school-wide framework with 5 levels that schools can work toward to create competency-based learning for all students. The vision that Mike posits is one where students have the ability to demonstrate and master transferable skills at their own pace. He dreams of having students be able to leave Kenowa Hills with a 21st century transcript that outlines and provides evidence for the skills a student has mastered that are applicable across a wide variety of college and career situations. But there's a lot of work required to build a system like this, and you can't rush this work, Mike says. According to Marzano's research, there are some fundamental pieces that need to be in place for such a system of schooling to thrive, such as, first and foremost, having a safe, supportive, and collaborative school culture. Throughout our conversation, Mike and I discussed his vision for learning, the roots of our current education system, and how they're working at Kenowa Hills to move toward personal mastery for all students.
The reality is, as a state and nation, we need all of our learners to be successful. Not most, not 99%, we need all of them to be successful. So, hearing that growing up certainly shifted a lot of my thoughts in terms of, here's the traditional model. It was never designed for all students' success. So what type of model could we have that can ensure all students will be successful?
I'm Nikki Herda, and this is Bright, Stories of Hope and Innovation in Michigan Classrooms, a podcast where we celebrate our state's educators and explore the future of learning. Let's dive in. So, for this episode, we decided to try something new. Rapid-fire questions, where we give our interviewees a series of prompts and they answer with the first thing that comes to mind. Here's how it went. All right. Favorite pizza topping?
Oh, onions.
Last show that you watched?
Seals.
Can't say I know that one. Coffee is...
Awesome.
Last thing that made you smile?
My daughter, Marilyn.
Favorite teacher?
Without a doubt, it would have been my high school basketball coach, Mr. Pumford.
Teachers are?
World changers.
Michigan is?
The best state in all of the United States.
Learning is?
Complex.
Innovation is?
Needed.
The person who most inspired your view on education?
My dad.
The future of education is?
Limitless.
Students need,
Love.
teachers need.
Love.
I'm hopeful that.
I'm hopeful that we can get through where we're at right now with the pandemic and be in a better place than we were prior to the pandemic.
Both of Mike's parents were educators. His father was a superintendent and his mother was a middle school teacher, and both shaped his views on education at a very young age. He shared with me how this inspired him along the same path.
Today, all students succeeding is kind of common lingo in education, but that was commonplace in my home growing up, hearing those words. And my mom was also an educator. She was a middle school teacher, so we had some great dialogue in the house growing up. But just to see how transformative education was in my dad's own life and kind of being that pathway out of a pretty challenging situation, and all the successes that he had as a result of educators was inspiring.
I'm wondering if you can tell me a little bit about your vision for learning and what has shaped that vision.
Well, I think, not to be repetitive, but it goes back to, I think, my childhood experience in living in a house where we talked regularly about the fact that all students need to be successful. And that word need, I'm not saying that subtly, because for years it was all students can be successful, but the reality is, as a state and nation, we need all of our learners to be successful. Not most, not 99%, we need all of them to be successful. So, hearing that growing up certainly shifted a lot of my thoughts in terms of, here's the traditional model. It was never designed for all students' success. So what type of model could we have that can ensure all students will be successful? So back to your question, what is my vision for education? Is that we transform into a system where we can ensure all students' success. That we lift up students' interests, their passions, their areas where they're talented. We accentuate them, we let them explore those in authentic ways, and we give them a pathway where they can leave our care confidently knowing the next step in their life.
Any thoughts on what this looks like in practice?
Yeah, I firmly believe, and I think the pandemic's going to reveal this, and if it's not the short term, it'll be the long term. I firmly believe we need to reimagine a system that's based on what students know and can do, and not based on their age, and not based on a grade level. And I'm not saying we need to eliminate grade levels and we shouldn't value where students are at socially and emotionally based on their age. That's not my point. What I'm saying is we need to have a system of education that takes our learners where they're at, puts them in their zone of proximal development so that we can reach them where they're at and take them to the next step in their learning. And I think too often the traditional system was designed for the middle. Students in the 25th to 75th percentile, but it's missed the students in the 75th to 100 and the 1st through 25th, if you will. We've designed for the middle instead of designed for all. However, if we flip that upside down and get away from this notion of grade levels and seat time and really design for the individual learner needs, I think we can transform and accomplish our vision of ensuring all students are successful. Too often I've seen over the years students in a particular learning continuum where it's not appropriate for one of two reasons. Students may already know and understand and can apply that content, or students don't have the foundational knowledge to be successful in that content to begin with. And again, it goes back to we're designing for the middle instead of designing for individual needs.
So it's easy, we talk a lot about the traditional system, right? And that's a common thread that I've seen in my conversations. And I guess I want to take a moment and think about why was the system that we have designed the way it was?
In my opinion, it was designed to sort and select. And it goes back to it does have its roots in the industrial era, but I believe the system was, we need to sort out who's going to live in the world of academia and is going to be college bound, and who's going to go to the pathway of manufacturing and a pathway that won't include college in their future. So again, in my opinion, it was designed to differentiate between those two and sort, select, and get folks in their lanes. But it was certainly never designed with the intent to ensure all students left our care with essential standards that they firmly understand, know, and can apply. It wasn't designed with the notion that there are skills and dispositions, regardless if you're going to college or career, that all students should have. And some of those skills and dispositions we all know. Regardless if students are going to college or career, they should be a complex thinker and problem solver. They should be able to communicate. Our students should be able to collaborate and be a good teammate with others, regardless of where they're heading in their next steps. But the initial design for education, it was the notion that we're going to ensure all students have these essential standards in their curriculum and a firm grasp on those, and these skills and dispositions as learners, wasn't the intent. The intent was to sort and select and be highly efficient in doing that.
I'm also thinking about how teachers have always wanted, I think, to do that. I think that's something that we sometimes forget in these conversations. I think teachers, good teachers, have always wanted to meet students where they are, but they're faced up against a lot of different challenges. Like you said earlier, they got to do standardized testing. They got to do this, and this, and they have to fit the needs that the system has put on them. But they also haven't had the technology that they have now, probably, to be able to differentiate for what does the average teacher have? 150 students?
Yeah, at the secondary level, that's a good estimate.
Yeah. Any thoughts on that?
No,
the role of the teacher in that?
What I hear you saying and what I completely agree with, effective teachers have a system that's working against them. They truly do. You look at our elementary teachers, and they have 30 different levels within their classroom because all learners are at a different level. And they want to differentiate and they want to meet their learners where they're at. But how can you possibly do that? That's a monumental task in itself. So I think it goes back to the system in that if the goal is to make sure all students are successful, not most, but all, the problem we run into right now is time is fixed. So all students are getting the same amount of time in their learning continuum at each grade level, regardless of whether or not that they can move forward in their learning continuum because they already know and can apply and understand those essential standards. Or we have some learners who might need the gift of time and might need additional supplemental supports to help them reach that target. So the traditional system, the analogy I love, it's not mine, but right now with the traditional system, time is fixed and learning's the variable. What happens if we flip that upside down and made learning the constant and time the variable? I think we could achieve our goal.
Would you call, your philosophy here competency-based education? Or would you call it something else?
Yeah, I would. I really like Marzano's work and how he conceptualizes competency-based education in 5 levels. And what we found out in the pandemic is the first foundational level, what Marzano calls safe, supportive, and collaborative cultures, is essential no matter what school you're in. If we don't have learning communities that are just rich with a caring, warm, supportive culture, anything we do beyond that is jeopardized. So in Marzano's framework, it all starts with school, climate, and culture. And we agree with that. And now more than ever, we know that's extremely important. But in order to get to a system that's truly competency-based, there are some key steps after that level one foundational work. We need to be thinking about our instructional framework. We have decades of research now that we can say with confidence what effective teaching looks like. And so how do we put in a system that lifts up our talent to make sure each and every educator in our classroom understands, can apply, and truly believes in effective instructional practices? I think we also need to take a good hard look, and this is level 3, what Marzano calls a guaranteed and viable curriculum. Our curriculum, Marzano and others would argue, is, if you look at it, is probably like a K-20 curriculum, a K-22. So it's not viable from the onset. So there's some intentionality schools need to do to make sure that they look at the curriculum, they look at the learning continuum, and really create one that's viable for our students. That work we've called it essential standards. So we've taken what we believe is most essential at each level and lifted that out as our must-dos, for lack of a better word. I think once we get to that step, a shift in reporting is needed. This is level 4 for Marzano. He refers to it as standards-based reporting, but essentially, right now with the traditional school, students get a transcript, a report card, and they'll see language arts A. Well, what does that mean? Or language arts D. What in the world does that mean for our students, for our parents? How did we get to that point? So with standards-based reporting, we're really reporting on our essential standards and where our learners are at on those. If we can do all of that, which those 4 levels in itself is a monumental lift, then you can play in level 5, which Marzano calls competency-based ed. He also calls it the rare air, because a lot of schools, I think, may want to get to level 5 and may skip to that level in being a competency-based district. But the work that precedes that is enormous in nature, and it's essential.
Dr. Robert Marzano developed a framework for high reliability schools that takes its inspiration from industries like nuclear energy and air traffic control, where failure is not an option. This innovative framework takes the criteria for high reliability in business and translates these concepts to schools, where advocates argue that, similarly, failure should not be seen as acceptable given the import of the profession in shaping young minds. There are 5 levels to this framework. The idea is that the first 3 levels are foundational, which means schools need to first have 1. A safe, supportive, and collaborative culture, 2. Effective teaching in every classroom, and 3. A guaranteed and viable curriculum in order to implement levels 4 and 5 with any degree of efficacy. Levels 4 and 5 are, respectively, standards-based reporting and competency-based education. Since meeting Marzano in person in Colorado and undergoing training in this framework, leadership at Kenowa Hills have been developing iterative plans at both the building and district level to design goals and action steps for each of these 5 levels to propel their district toward a competency-based future where all students can master key concepts at their own pace. I want to hear, if you're willing to tell, what you're doing at Kenowa to try to embody this vision. You alluded to a couple things, but I'm wondering if you could talk about the kind of innovations you're trying to make in Kenowa Hills.
So that level 1 that I referred to, which really aims at culture and climate, one of the things we've done district-wide is gone through a training through the flipping group called Capturing Kids' Hearts. I don't know if you're familiar with that work.
No.
But essentially it gets at ensuring that we have safe and welcoming learning communities and classroom spaces, and that it really gets at the fact that our kids need to know we care first and foremost.
I'm not sure if I'm just inventing this parallel, but it almost sounds the way that you're talking about these levels a bit like the Maslow's hierarchy of needs, because it's got
Yeah,
the base.
yeah, for
It's,
sure.
it's only also strange because their names sound quite similar to Maslow and Marzano.
Yeah. So again, one of the big things we want to do in level one, we want to implement capturing kids' hearts, and that we think that's essential in helping us grow in our level one school climate and culture goal. And one of the analogies I love with level one, the 5-level approach, the high reliability schools approach, in my opinion, it's not a checklist. You're never, in my opinion, as a school or a district, going to check off school culture and that you finally arrived and you don't need to worry about it ever again. The reality is culture and climate is something you need to continuously grow and improve upon. You never arrive. So I love the framework because it gets us embedded into a continuous improvement mindset that we're always going to have goals centered on level one culture and climate. It's who we are. It's our identity as educators. So some practical examples, I would say, with what we do with capturing kids' hearts, which gets at our level one continuous improvement efforts. We greet our students at the door. We want to make sure we welcome them in a caring fashion each and every day. We create social contracts with our students. And a social contract is simply an agreement of how we're going to treat each other, how we want to be treated as teachers, how we want to be treated by our students. We start the day with good news in our classrooms. Much like your icebreaker that was kind of fun, we want to make sure we're celebrating things that are happening in our students' lives that are good, and lift those up and celebrate. One of the things that is important to us right now with culture and climate is growing as an organization with diversity, belonging, equity, and inclusion. It's extremely important that, again, each and every one of our learners feels valued and appreciated, so that our DBEI work will be ongoing and embedded in that level one continuous improvement framework.
Though we didn't have time in our interview to dive into how Kenowa Hills is addressing every single one of these 5 levels, Mike and I did explore what their next steps are for this huge re-envisioning of what learning looks like in their district. In particular, we talked about Mike's vision for a 21st century transcript that's more conducive to career and college readiness, and the role that technology plays in this vision for learning.
Yeah, I would say one of the biggest things we're engaged in right now in level 5 and thinking about a competency-based system is we've created what we call our profile of a graduate. And these aren't necessarily academic skills and competencies. They're more at those skills and dispositions that we want for our learners, regardless if they're college or career bound. We feel like these profile of a graduate skills and dispositions are essential. And so we've begun implementing lessons at the high school level. So our students are having experiences with our profile of a graduate. And it gets back to some of the things I alluded to earlier, but we have 5 key skills and dispositions we want for all of our learners. We want them to be a responsible collaborator, someone who works well with others in teams. We want them to be impactful citizens. So when they leave our care, hopefully we are equipping world changers, for lack of a better word, and that they're going to leave and make a difference in our world. We want skilled communicators. We also want complex thinkers and problem solvers, and then we want empowered learners. We're really trying to emphasize that learning is a lifelong adventure. We all learn while we're on the earth. That's how we are as humans. So we want students to feel empowered in their learning, that they have agency and control over that.
I'm curious, and it's okay if you're not there yet, but with Kenowa Hills, but does technology play a role in this at all?
Technology certainly has played a role in us really better understanding where our learners are at, maybe more precisely. And that's not to say we don't have great formative assessment strategies happening in the classroom, but it's always good to triangulate data that we're seeing qualitatively with some quantitative data as well. And technology can help with that. I think technology can also help so one of our dreams is really reimagining what the 21st century transcript can look like for our learners. Right now, the transcript we send out is, again, English 9, here's your grade. English 10, here's your grade. But what if we had a transcript that articulated our profile of a graduate skills and dispositions, and we could create a digital portfolio, a digital backpack that our learners can accumulate evidences and artifacts of them being a complex problem solver over their time with us. So once they leave our care, if we have the technology in place, the technology tools, they can go to college and career and say, let me show you how I am a complex problem solver. Let me show you how I am a good teammate and a responsible collaborator. And that they have this digital backpack of, again, examples and artifacts that can speak to that skill or disposition.
Here at Michigan Virtual, we've spent a lot of time thinking about the concept of flexible learning models, which is a broad term that could encompass more specific pedagogies like competency-based education or personal mastery. At the heart of it, what we're seeing in both research and experience is that it's becoming increasingly obvious that there's no one-size-fits-all model that works for all students. Whenever we try to apply rigid, standardized models to real students, some inevitably get left behind. I asked Mike what he thought about this and how the concept of flexibility might relate to his vision for student learning. Does the term flexible learning models mean anything to you?
With flexible learning models, my mind jumps immediately to the fact that we need to get to a place in education that honors the fact that learning happens outside of the walls at school, that students are acquiring skills, they're acquiring experiences in their learning that should count, for lack of a better word, and be honored in our school system and our process for education. So you're seeing some of this flexibility and adaptability right now play out with technology, with things like digital badging and micro-credentialing. And even to the point where in our learning continuum, being able to say with confidence, we know you've had this experience, let's say in FIRST robotics. So based on that experience, show me what you know, and then this part of our learning continuum in this class, we know you've already achieved mastery. So you don't need to just sit here in class for the next 3 to 4 weeks on this unit because you already understand and have a grasp on this concept. Instead, we're going to think differently about a learning experience that makes more sense for you. That's what comes to mind on my end.
Toward the end of our conversation, I asked Mike what he feels hopeful about as we finally begin to emerge from the COVID-19 pandemic. He shared his reflections on the difference between schooling loss and learning loss, and how he hopes we're moving toward a future where we can truly meet the needs of all students. The reflection I was making is that, you talked about those 5 levels, and how when COVID came along, maybe you were climbing them. It almost sounds like you had to go back to level 1.
Yeah.
And I don't think that you are alone in that. In fact, I'm hearing that from all the different districts that we work with and the district leaders is that, it makes sense going back to level 1, right? Even if you envision it as the Maslow's hierarchy of needs, like just the basic human needs.
Absolutely.
That students needed. So, what's next, I guess, what are you hopeful for? We ended our rapid fire questions on that, but
yeah,
it's easy you mentioned being hopeful for the pandemic to actually, in the long run, create change. Is that, you want to expound on that a little bit?
Absolutely. I think the first thing that pops to mind is I've got a real problem with the words learning loss. I don't believe our students have encountered learning loss. What they've encountered is a pandemic, and the result of the pandemic has been schooling loss. And that's much different than learning loss. So what I'm hopeful for, if we can take a step back and really think broadly, think differently, is that the only way out of a post-pandemic system of education, in my opinion, is we need to meet our students where they're at and their learning. And for each and every student, that's going to look different. It's going to look different based on the supports that they had during the pandemic. It's going to look different based on whether or not they were able to attend face-to-face or had to experience their learning in a virtual setting. So our learners are all over the place right now, and that's okay. They've experienced schooling loss. What I think the pandemic's going to force schools to realize is the only way out of this, again, is to meet our learners where they're at, to teach in the zone of proximal development. And if we don't apply some of what we know about competency-based education in that process, I think we're going to experience some struggles. I really struggle with the notion that our students may need more instructional days or they may need more seat time. Some might. That might be true for some. Others may not. It's not a one-size-fits-all solution. And again, that gets to the heart of what competency-based education is about. It's about each and every student and what they need.
After my conversation with Mike, I was left inspired by his vision for a system of schooling that is flexible and adaptable enough to meet the needs of all students as they work toward personal mastery of key concepts. Even more so, I was impressed to learn how they're putting this theory into action at Kenowa Hills Public Schools, which is less than half an hour away from where I myself grew up in Western Michigan. After talking with Mike, I spent some time researching Marzano's framework for high-reliability schools and found it both intuitive and compelling, shedding light on what matters when ensuring all students are able to succeed in our schools. If you're interested in learning more about this and seeing related resources on this topic, check out the companion blog post to this episode at michiganvirtual.org/bright. Perhaps my most jarring takeaway from our conversation was entertaining the implications of the question, what if there's a better way than grade levels to frame how students progress through the K-12 curriculum? What if rather than basing academic progression on the age of a student, we instead focused on what they know and what they can do? What does this mean and how do we move forward? It's a big concept to wrestle with, but important, I would think, to at least consider when imagining a better future for all. As we work together to reimagine this future, we'll continue to celebrate Michigan educators, sharing their hopes, their fears, their dreams, and their beliefs in what's best for our children as we move forward into a new era of post-pandemic learning. Without a doubt, it's going to be hard work to build from the ground up and create highly reliable schools where leaving students behind is not an option. But with leaders like Mike forging our path forward, if there's one thing we're certain of, it's that the future is bright. Thank you for joining us for this episode of Bright, Stories of Hope and Innovation in Michigan Classrooms. This podcast is produced by Herbie Gaylord, is hosted by me, Nikki Herda, and is made possible by Michigan Virtual, a nonprofit organization that's leading and collaborating to build learning environments for tomorrow. Education is changing faster than ever. Discover new models and resources to move learning forward at your school at michiganvirtual.org.